Welcome guys to my channel. Today in my second part of the South Florida Soccer History series, I'm going to be talking about the Fort Lauderdale Strikers who played in the old version of the North American Soccer League, or NASL. They played from 1977 to 1983. Now let's get right into it. So let's talk about the relocation of the Miami Toros, which led to a professional team playing in Fort Lauderdale. So in 1977 this happened, where Elizabeth Robbie kind of saw that the attendances were waning in Miami. You know, they probably weren't doing as well as she hoped. She decided to move the team from Miami to Fort Lauderdale. Now, something to note about Fort Lauderdale is it's really like outskirts of Miami, but at the time it was booming. It's not increasing in population as much as it was back in the day. It was increasing in population quite a bit at the time. So I think that's why it seemed like a bit more of an appealing market. Fort Lauderdale was looking for a major sports franchise for years, and they finally got their first major sports franchise when they ended up getting a team in the old NASL. So when Miami Toros moved over to Fort Lauderdale, they were renamed to become the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Something to note that I forgot to note in the last video was that Elizabeth Robbie was actually, when she became the owner of the Miami Toros, the team prior to the Fort Lauderdale Strikers that was moved to Fort Lauderdale to become the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, she actually was the first female owner of a major sports team in the US from my research that I found out, which is very notable and kind of interesting to see that. When the Miami Toros moved to Fort Lauderdale, they actually moved to Lockhart Stadium, which was part of a high school sports complex where there was Lockhart Stadium, in which they moved to, which was like a football stadium that could be used for soccer, and then it was later renovated to kind of be used mainly for soccer. And then there was Fort Lauderdale Stadium, which was mainly just a baseball stadium, so they didn't want to play in that. So they played in Lockhart Stadium. The stadium was pretty small at the time. It was 7,800 people it could hold. So in 1977, when they first moved to Fort Lauderdale, they actually did pretty well in terms of attendance, getting over 8,000 fans per game at Lockhart Stadium. Actually, that's quite well because that means that they're selling out almost all of their games. So then they looked to expand it over the coming years. Ron Newman, who was the first manager of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, had quite a successful season as he made them get to the playoffs in their first season in Fort Lauderdale. So now we'll talk about the early years, which was really early success. So 1978 and 1979. So in terms of off-the-field success, in terms of fan support, they did well in that respect, as they got 8,000 fans on average per game in 1978, and then they went around 10,000 fans on average per game in 1980 as their stadium was expanded. And their stadium kept getting expanded until, I believe from my research, it was 19,000 people it could hold, Lockhart Stadium, which is kind of crazy how much it was expanded from 7,800 to roughly 19,000 people it could hold. The club went on to sign the likes of Gerd Muller, Gordon Banks, Tefio Subias, and Jan van Beveren. I probably butchered all of those names, I'm sorry if I did. Gerd Muller is a player that, he's a notable player. As I remember, looking at like soccer history books years ago, and you'd always see his name when you're reading about West Germany and how they're making it to the World Cup. So he's a very notable player on this list. The team went on to make the playoffs for both of these years, so they made the playoffs 1977, 1978, 1979, so they're doing quite well. And this led up to 1980, which was their Soccer Bowl season, which is basically, if you watch MLS, it was like the MLS Cup of NASL at the time. And the Soccer Bowl was like the final. So I'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going to talk about how the 1980 season led up to the Soccer Bowl final, and then I'll talk about the final as well. So 1980 was actually a very weird season for the Strikers. So you would think that if a team made it all the way to the Soccer Bowl final, the locker room atmosphere would be pretty good. Things would be pretty hunky-dory. It's not like they're going to have a bunch of internal conflicts, but it was the total opposite. There was a ton of internal conflicts. So basically, former NHL player Bob Lemieux was hired as the GM When Bob Lemieux was hired, it seems, at least from my research, that it almost marked the start of all these issues and internal issues that the team had, as he immediately fired the extremely successful and popular manager in Ron Newman, who had made the playoffs in 1977, 78, and 79. So it seems kind of weird that he would go out and fire him. Since he was fired in the off season, he went and got a bunch of investors to move a team from a different city. I can't quite remember, but he got them to move a team, a few investors to move a team all the way to Miami to become the Miami Americans and to rival the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Now that team failed within a season. They were not very successful, to say the least, about them. And actually, it got so bad with that team that Ron Newman left midway through the season. So Ron Newman eventually became the manager of the San Diego Sockers, if you're interested in that, because that's actually kind of notable to this 1980 season. He joined them midway through the 1980 season after he decided to quit being the manager for Miami Americans, who played in the American Soccer League, which was like the second division. So in terms of who replaced Ron Newman, it was former Dutch international Cor van der Hart, who became the new manager, and he right from the get-go had a lot of internal issues with the GM Bob Lemieux, and they basically had tons of conflicts throughout the whole season, and it really didn't help the squad out. This manager, Cor van der Hart, too, also had issues with some of the players. Even one of the players accused him of basically scamming him or stealing $30,000 from him. I'm not sure if that was ever proven or anything like that, but I think that really just shows how much internal conflicts were around in the 1980 season for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. So despite all these issues, Fort Lauderdale Strikers made the playoffs. They didn't just make the playoffs, they went all the way to the Soccer Bowl final as they beat, I believe in the semifinals, they beat the San Diego Sockers, Ron Newman's team that he joined midway through the season. They beat his team to make it all the way to the Soccer Bowl, to make it to the NASL finals, you could say. And they played the New York Cosmos, who are very well known in NASL. You know, many of you watching may have heard of the New York Cosmos, where they had the likes of Pele and all of those players. But they went and played not in New York, they played actually at RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C. And they ended up not having a good game. Gerd Muller ended up getting injured midway through the game. He came off at halftime. They ended up losing 3-0. I believe there was even a player who decided just not to play for the team right ahead of the start of the game as well. Something of note too, I didn't note this in some of the notable players, but Ray Hudson was actually captaining the team in the 1980 Soccer Bowl final. And he's not as notable for what he did on the pitch as at least in the US and Canada, but he's more notable for what he's done since playing, where he actually became the Miami Fusion manager later on in 2000 and 2001, I believe, and he's been a very popular commentator since. So after this 1980 season, Cor van der Hart and Bob Lemieux were both fired, and this season was also where attendance, this is kind of a separate note from the Bob Lemieux and Cor van der Hart firing, but this was also, as much as it wasn't successful in terms of how things went off the field, for the most part, with all these internal issues, what was successful off the field was the attendance, which was 14,000 people. This was where it really peaked, the attendance for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, and then it started waning after that. So I'm just going to quickly note about indoor soccer, because some of you may know who are watching this video, NASL had a lot of indoor soccer seasons, and they weren't super successful for every team. That included Fort Lauderdale Strikers. So typically, while Fort Lauderdale Strikers tended to get over 10,000 people per game in the outdoor season, they only got like under 2,000 people per game in the indoor season. Players like Muller and some of the other star players just decided to not play. They thought it was kind of a waste of their time, so they ended up not playing with a lot of their star players, which didn't help in attracting fans to the game. They also played in a terrible stadium in the Hollywood Sportorium, which I saw one photo of, and it looks terrible. I think they wanted to move into an arena because it's indoor soccer, into a new arena, but there was no really other better option for indoor soccer at the time, so they had to stay in the Hollywood Sportorium, and there was even seasons where they decided not to play just because of the lack of a good arena. And then they ended up stopping play as they ended up losing game after game after game. And they also never made the playoffs in the indoor season, despite their success in the outdoor season. So now let's talk about the final years, so 1981, 1982, and 1983. So there wasn't really some big demise for the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. It was pretty good. They continued to make the playoffs. They made the playoffs in 1981, 82, and 83. So they would make the playoffs for the 7 years that they existed. The Strikers also continued to get over 10,000 people per game. They had a slow decline to 10,000 people per game in the 1983 season, but they were still pretty high on attendance. Things were doing decently, but Elizabeth Robbie, I think, saw that the team was waning a little bit, so then she decided to go on and move the team to Minnesota because I think she figured that maybe there could be a bit more off the field success as well. The team was doing well on the pitch, but I think she was a bit worried that there would be a decline similar to the way the Miami Toros had a big decline as well. So she moved the team to Minnesota. Now we're going to talk about the post-Fort Lauderdale Strikers, kind of what's happened since. So with the Minnesota Strikers, they played one season in the North American Soccer League where they got 14,000 people per game. So it seemed like a decent calculation by Elizabeth Robbie to move the team to Minneapolis, St. Paul area to rename them to Minnesota Strikers, as it seemed like they were getting decent off the field success. Maybe that was just because it was their first season, but they seemed to be doing quite well. But then, after one season, what happened? Well, NASL folded. There was really no established outdoor soccer league at the time. So what did they do? They moved to indoor soccer. And although it wasn't the most successful for Fort Lauderdale Strikers, it was quite successful for Minnesota Strikers. There wasn't as much outdoor soccer, so people just went to indoor games. And they actually were reasonably successful, getting around 5,000 people per game. And I think they made the playoffs sometimes. They didn't make the playoffs other times. You know, they weren't some terrible team on the pitch as well. But then the team ended up folding in 1988, so that wasn't the greatest for the Minnesota Strikers and the fans of the team. In terms of the identity of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, it's kind of been revived, I believe 3 times to different extents. You know, some teams have been more successful than others. I would say the most successful one, or the most notable one to me, is the Fort Lauderdale Strikers, who didn't play in the old NASL, but who played in the new NASL. And they ended up folding in 2016, but I believe they were founded around 2006 or so as like Miami FC, and then they eventually rebranded to the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. They were one of the teams that were one of the more notable teams in the new NASL. Of course, that new NASL league isn't having any seasons at the moment. I'm not sure if they've completely folded, but I did know that they're like suing US Soccer or something like that. I'm not sure how that's worked out for them. But they didn't actually fold because of problems with NASL. They folded because they had money issues, so they ceased operations with that. So they were the most successful, from what I know, revival of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers since then. There hasn't been any revival of the Fort Lauderdale Strikers in the past few years. There's a bit of speculation that perhaps Inter Miami would go on and revive the team to be their USL team, because they're fielding a team in USL this season, but they ended up stopping those rumors as they released their identity just a few days ago, or just over a week ago, where the team is going to be named Fort Lauderdale Soccer Club. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Please like if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you want to see more videos about South Florida soccer and about other content on soccer. So thank you for watching, and until next time, see ya!